I'll just begin in like 10 seconds, grabbing some water. Cool. I'll take POIs any which way. Preferably just verbalize them, but just like don't repeat it like every single second. Starting in three, two, one. Why do we essentially regret the trend of going ahead and like off on off or debate shifting to offline again? The major idea on OG is this: the ability for people to grow as debaters, the ability for people to continue as debaters, and the welfare and generally the debating community and debating as an activity being better off is the main crux of what OG case will be. Let's talk about what the counterfactual is going to look like. This is going to be fairly simple actually, because understand, at a point in time, the trend is not shifted back to offline debating. Most majors are like most all majors are going to be online. All big tournaments are going to happen online regardless. That means no matter what circuit you're in, you're probably having access to immense number of tournaments happening throughout different circuits from different time zones, depending on where you want to do. That also, secondly, I think even the tournaments which are held locally are which might be offline are probably rare in nature. So they might exist at some point in time, similar to how offline debating, like online debating, was before COVID. But that's the narrative shift which exists. Then let's talk about first what are essentially the problems with offline debating. The first and the biggest problem with offline debating is basically it lacks accessibility and does not include most people in the first place. There are multiple mechanisms and reasons for this. First, just in terms of financial barriers, any offline debating requires several things. That looks like travel, even if it's within your country, is going to have to travel from different cities. That means time is wasted, your capital is wasted. You need to probably miss out on several different things. You spend a lot of money just to go ahead and do this. That's just on travel. Second, you have to stay somewhere else. You have to pay for the accommodation. You have to pay for the whole tournament cost, which is probably going to be immensely higher. If you're trying to go for a good tournament that probably is another country, you have to then pay for visas, for flight tickets, for hotels in different countries, and probably pay bribery to different corrupt officers just for you to go ahead and debate in the first place. That means the ability for people to go ahead and pursue all this is already lower because there is too much workload on you too. But secondly, this is just going to be, regardless of what is happening, it's going to be expensive for the majority of debating community, and that's the immense harm. Because the idea is simple: at a point in time, you don't have debate shifting to offline
POI.
tournaments. You probably have most people being able to still engage with most kinds of tournament, even if what have happened. I'll explain this later with examples as well. But secondly, it's also about geographic inclusivity. That means online debating allowed people from underdeveloped circuits where they probably do not have offline tournaments, because you do not have people who are interested enough, or you do not have people who are qualified enough to conduct this tournament or host this tournament, because these offline tournaments require good infrastructure. That looks like good institutions wherein which one allow people to enter, but secondly, institutions which are not corrupt and which are okay with people trying to talk about things which might be of different notions. That means most institutions which probably say that, oh, we are probably right wing leaning because the government is right wing and we are nationalistic, don't allow other kinds of ideas to come into the institution, therefore do not allow debating tournaments. So half the institutions will go out just because they're publicly funded, and governments do not want people to go out and do things like this. And that's something which happens right now. That's the reason only certain institutions are able to host debate tournaments throughout the country. That's why you see some good top institutions able to host top tournaments, but most of their institutions are not to host tournaments because one, they're probably not having geographical proximity with other people, but also not having good administration too. But secondly, I think this is also with regards to the relation between countries in general. That means it's if the relation between two countries is bad, certain debaters will just be left out just because they cannot get a visa from Pakistan, like just because they're from Pakistan, or just because they're from Islamic country in the first place. But secondly, it's also about the currency disparity. It's not the fault of the people that the economy of their country is not as far as, let's say, in a developed country. So if they have to go to another country to go ahead and engage in the top quality tournament, the amount of money to spend is just immense, especially which was already very high. Now because of currency barriers, it's going to be like at least 10-50 times more than what you could have probably done. But thirdly, how is it more like how is the online debating able to make this extremely more inclusive? Let's talk about people who are disabled, because debating is one of the rare sports wherein you have the ability to include most people whatsoever, no matter if they have chronic illnesses, they have physical disabilities, or whatsoever. Why? Because the only thing you need is to just say things what you feel and say what you exactly like, etc., etc. What this means is this activity becomes exclusive, and these people have no way to go ahead and engage in anything whatsoever over at a point in time,
You know
those
why?
opportunities are already rare at all points in time. But then fourthly, I think it's also the ability for you to gather prestige and reputation. Understand, debating as a sport runs a lot on the people who have experience. So if I'm probably from a reputed institution, I'm probably going to get an easier win than, let's say, from a small institution. What online debating does is gives people to get a platform to go ahead and gain this reputation and prestige. Why? Because offline formats systematically privilege wealthy institutions, because now they have the money to fund their trips to come, but my institution does not pay me, therefore I cannot come to debate at a good tournament. Therefore they're able to accumulate this reputation prestige again and they will do. But thirdly, just in terms of time, you can probably debate at any time you're free. I'm probably from a space wherein I have to probably do jobs, therefore I cannot debate in daytime, but I'm probably free at night. So online debating makes it accessible people to go ahead and do different things. But then let's make a very important clarification here. Before I do that, take a POI from closing. Opening.
Are you not debating at an online tournament right now?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. At a point in time, debating has shifted to online tournaments. The online tournaments are always seen as secondary in nature. You are probably just subordinates of any other big tournament. That means my ability to probably do good at Diliman Online Open is never going to be similar to what I can do at probably CEDO or probably a tournament that is happening offline in the first place. That means the prestige and reputation which is amount is there. So what you always feel is, oh, when you have to think of someone who is good, you think of, oh, who broke at the biggest major possible, or who broke at the last big offline tournaments, etc. You don't think of person who won the event, because online tournaments can happen everywhere. You just don't value online tournaments in the first place on the other contracts because they're subordinate at all points in time. Then let's talk about why exactly is this good, because let's talk about growth. The reason why most people are not able to continue debating, and this is something we've seen even though they're talented, is just because they don't have access. This is something we've seen in different circuits, especially Asian circuit, especially circuits like India, wherein there were several people who were able to do extremely good and become very good at majors because debating was online. But right now, because of visa issues, because of travel issues, the amount of participation in like countries like India or countries and have is immensely lower. That means a very important thing for these institutions to sustain is to have regular access to online tournaments, because once you shift, this goes away. This is something which is empiric loop which is happening right now in countries like India, in throughout Asia, in Philippines, Pakistan, all of that in the first place. Why is that not happening at a point in time online basis? Simply because one, you have growth, second you have exposure. Why do you have growth? One, just in terms of feedback, you have a lot more things to get feedback on. You have more judges, you have different judging styles, you have ability to get different kinds of feedback. On exposure, you talk to people from different circuits. It's just like you're not able to relate with people around you because the circuit is so small. You can probably talk to people from different circuits. They're open because that is the primary channel for you to communicate. But secondly, I think in terms of funding, tournaments are just significantly cheaper, especially prestigious tournaments. But also the scope of giving scholarships is higher because the infrastructure needed for you to give scholarships not that much. So you can probably give out a lot more scholarships to help people come and debate. What this means at the end of this debate, the community is a lot more accessible. People who would have opted out will now not opt out. Therefore, community is larger in nature. You have more ideas. Therefore, debating flourishes a lot more. For those reasons, extremely proud.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Hello.
I prefer to take my POIs in chat. I'll try to take one in my speech. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's start with breaking down the assumption that OG runs, which is that online will sort of die or people will suddenly begin to not opt into it if we revert back to offline. I think the main framing here I want to point out is that no, this is simply not true. Online tournaments has not died and will never die. I think there's always high demand in the moment for online debating, especially for developing regions and even developed regions around the world. I think there's several reasons to this. One, it is easier for varsity debate clubs to, let's say, do club fundraising through online tournaments to get more money to maybe get some coaching for their own debaters. I think online tournaments are simply more convenient. People obviously want to be on the comfort of their own home, and people obviously also want to make it pay like don't have to pay so much money for it, right? But I think two, the vast majority of people prep for majors using online tournaments anyways. This shows that a lot of alternatives would have still occurred anyways, even if offline tournaments was still the norm. But three, sparring is always online to access different regions and circuits. The rampant existence of online sparring will probably have also or anyways led to tournaments at the end of the day. The implication is threefold. One, online tournaments is always going to be very accessible. Online tournaments is always the best alternative for almost all debaters. but two, a lot of initiatives to maintain demand of online events like Uhuru World, or even like having all these free YouTube workshop videos is really important. So having a major break in status quo is not impossible, and it's not limited to a dream for a debater anyways. But three, only high level tournaments are moving offline. Things like Cambridge or LSE, which only maintains the only top, maybe like the 5% of debating in the world, it watches a lot of OG's material on many debaters possibly not even breaking out in the circuit or not breaking out in a certain region. The main argument from OO is very simple. I'll take that later. Is that offline debating provides a more meaningful experience for the vast majority of debaters, because sure, yes, maybe accessibility is like going to be symmetric under both sides of the house, but I think the tipping point then becomes the experience of the sport itself, what debaters are able to garner for that, and what keeps them going in the sport. There's several layers to this. One is that local tournaments that are in person are on the rise and still going to be very accessible for three main reasons. One, a lot of these local tournaments that what you see in Malaysia, for example, run in the local country, so they use the local currency and are also sponsored by a lot of student bodies. But two, local debating communities usually come from local debating unions that creates a sense of unity and uniformity within a certain country or within a certain region. But three, local nationals are still taken very seriously by a lot of debaters as a major accomplishment. So there's still a lot of opt-in for these tournaments at the end of the day. These are really important, especially for developing regions or countries, for two reasons. One is often the first step that up-and-coming debaters take to access debating and communities, competitions and tournaments like SSIDC in East Malaysia, where debaters have real chances in-person first chances to make friends or to enjoy the sport at a local level, and to access or like know get some knowledge from really famous judges within the local region. But also too is a very good stepping stone for debaters to transition into online debating in a way that can complement their ability more easily. The second section to this argument is that the trend in the status quo of like debating in general is going into a more hybrid environment where online and offline are coexisting at the end of the day. This is better for debaters in general. One, you can still access a lot of benefits of offline events on top of online tournaments that still exist either way. But two, online debating exposes the need for accessibility and equity within the sport that now offline events could have like more incentive to maintain lower barriers of entry compared to before. This means that we're still going to have a lot of these free online workshops and coaching sessions by clubs and NGOs to make debating less scary and more engaging to high school students and novices at the end of the day, right? What is the counterfactual then? I think one, online debating under a government side of the world sort of becomes less appealing in a certain way, especially for new up and coming debaters in the online circuit, for the very reason that they feel this sport is too detached, or they're not able to build really genuine connections or meaningful connections within the sport itself. Most debaters, again, are still very just like novices and up and coming people. They don't know a lot of the like different areas and aspects that comes to the sport in general. I think having online just purely online tournaments, or the vast majority of tournaments being all online, is going to turn a lot of these people away from it because they don't feel like they're able to make genuine connections. But two, debating is just a lot more boring if it's just fully online, and it's sort of like people don't want to continuously feel the bore of purely online debating. That's why even competitions like EUDC 2022, which was the first ever major to be held since 2020, came during the pandemic because the debating community still always pushed for offline tournaments at the end of the day. I think thirdly, OG, or even like maybe generally like government in general, will claim that the impact of online debating in terms of creating a more accessible and lucrative environment for debating are symmetric, and that's probably true. The tipping point again then becomes the experience of the sport itself, if these things are going to be purely symmetrical under both sides of the house. What debaters are able to gain from that, and what debaters are going to be able to feel from the sport at the end of the day. Why does this win against the accessibility metric in the debate that I think both gov benches are going to run on? I think firstly, because accessibility is not exclusive, accessibility is going to always be inconsistent demand, and this demand and supply will be kept going going forward in the status quo into the future. We don't think that debate is always about needing all these debaters to go out into WUDC or ABP or WSDC tournaments and to break in those tournaments and to fly all the way out there. The actual debate experience is genuinely just about the experience of being able to debate with competitively with certain people, being able to go to your local nationals, to meet your new friends, to build new relationships, to go to socials and have a great time because you're able to network with a lot of these people that you once thought you couldn't network with before. But two, debating is not that expensive offline. It's only just the major international tournaments that pose a much higher barrier of entry. But debating, especially let's say like local nationals again, is not like automatically locking out all the other debaters in that region generally, especially if it's run in local currency, that makes it much more accessible for other varsity debate clubs in other universities to be able to sponsor their own debaters to go to these regions. But thirdly and lastly, university support also exists for the vast majority of debaters. This is also a reason why you see a lot of these like institutional debaters coming out and going for all these competitions. With that clear, win.
And can the speaker for the speech or DPM?
Yeah, just give me like 10-20 seconds.
Sure.
All right. I'll take POIs exclusively through chat. Don't interrupt because that disrupts the flow of my speech. Just chat. Just type it in the chat. Yep. So I'll take it from CEO. I found that. Oh, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is funny that the year I decide to go to ABP, the next year is going to be an online major. So I just want to point that comment. I have 3 comments on opening opposition because their case is highly uncomparative and they actually don't have a positive alternative. The first thing that they say is that people in local tournaments are able to socially gather more because like novices or people who are beginners are able to meet judges. We concede to this. We don't disapprove of this. But the reason for why these people are not able to access a judge who's from Europe or a judge who's from America, who's likely to be able to give them more clarity, or why specifically Europeans are not able to access the meta of the Asian debating circuit, is specifically because of the reasons of financial barriers and everything that goes unresponded to by LO from that PM gave you. It is also specifically true that if you're an institution who does not have a lot of reputation in the circuit, and even within that local circuit, you're not likely to interact with a lot of people from higher debating echelons of the circuit because they don't think of you as a good debater, but they also don't think of you as a debater who has proved yourself. So it is not likely to, and is highly speculative, why novices and beginners are likely to socialize with people more. I would argue that the flip of this is better on online debating when you have Discord chats, when you have social media messengers, when you have Facebook messengers, and specifically other kinds of alternatives that you have existing in online debating, that you can like reach out to these people much more, and they're likely to see it because the cost of responding to you in an online tournament is much lower than the cost of responding to you in an offline tournament when you have to actually like respond to that person. But even if that mechanism doesn't work, I think the first mechanism of reputation is much more persuasive. The second thing that they say is that online tournaments have to exist in order to compete with offline tournaments, because then offline tournaments will become much more subsidized and like much better. So this is a problem solution mismatch, because in order, if the fact that if offline tournaments have to have a competition mechanism with online tournaments in order to become like have more scholarships and fees and stuff like that, then the problem is that these offline tournaments inherently are privileged and are specifically tournaments that are inaccessible to a lot of people. They should do this regardless on either side of the house. It is not an argument that you can make exclusively from opening opposition. I think specifically offline tournaments are also likely to do and have these incentives on our side of the house when there's also likely to be much more backlash, specifically when their competition unlocks, when online tournaments have much more people, much more number of participants, much more number of teams and judges, and actually better feedback and much more better integration of novices into the circuit happening within those online tournaments. People are likely to see that online majors are the next big thing, and why are offline majors not doing that? That's why the flip of this comparative is much better on the benefit on opening government. That's why opening op is out of this debate. The third thing that they say is that they say like online tournament are much accessible, and the reason for why they can exist on our side is like we will just have on the same level. So I'm not unclear why exactly are these on the equal number of levels of offline tournaments. Are they lesser in number? Are they more in number? We take the trade-off. We actually take the trade-off and we say that we concede that these online tournaments can be better, online majors can be better, and specifically because of the benefits that we give. So this is a characterization debate on harms and benefits. I'm going to weigh the scale of the impacts onto this on 5 levels. The first impact that we derive out of this is specifically onto novice debaters. There are 3 reasons under this. Firstly, when you start debating, you're likely to, as a novice, you're likely to be demotivated because of the fact that you can't receive feedback specifically from judges within offline tournaments, because they are people who only interact with their own friend circles. But because of the same X that LO gives you, these are people who only interact with their own social circles and their friends. Secondly, it is also true that if you're someone from a nascent SOC or someone from a lower developed SOC within the circuit, it's likely true that reputation biases exist within people. So it might be a matter of subjectivity, but for the vast majority of people, in order to become friends with someone or in order to get much better feedback, you need to be actually have some amount of networking, some amount of connection in order to engage within that feedback. Much more like this just assumes on opening opposition and on our side as well that some people act in good faith and give you that feedback. But the vast majority of people in those instances maybe don't do that. So it's highly speculative on opening opposition why people just do that out of pure good and why like inherently online tournaments are better. But I just want to posit the flip of this. I say that specifically Discord chats and specifically tournaments wherein people are likely to like see that online tournaments are much better is because of the fact that people within different circuits are not likely to be assholes, right? The scale of this is that there are lesser assholes in the vast majority of the world, and there are more assholes when you constrict yourself to only your local circuit. That's the simple intuition for why like specifically online debating is much more accessible, because you have much better people and much better debaters acting in good faith and actually going to give you integrated feedback and stuff like that on Discord, on Gmeet, on Facebook and Messenger and stuff like that. The second reason for why debating and the mechanism for this is directly linked to PM on saying why debating is a community-based sport. So it's likely true that seniors also give feedbacks to juniors because they want to promote this culture of giving feedback, of integrating much more novices into the circuit and integrating much more growth into you as a debater, because they want to see the circuit develop and they have multiple obligations to the circuit because they have a pass down mechanism that their own senior did this, then they did this, and then they will pass this on to other people. These are instances of good faith which increase on scale. That's the weighing for why exactly opening government unlocks all the benefits of why novices are better integrated in the circuit and your growth as a debater is more certain and is more likely. That's the first impact that we certainly derive. The second impact that we derive is on diversity and on specifically on the fundings that you receive. So it's specifically true that opening opposition does not respond to the arguments of bad administration existing within institutional fundings, where you don't have administration like directly like rejecting, specifically administration rejecting your plea for going to Malaysia, or specifically like not even listening to you and like just thrashing you. This is also likely to demotivate you even if you're an experienced debater, but also as a beginner debater when you just ask them, can I get a train ticket to go to like an intercity tournament or stuff like that. What you do then on their side is feel bad and feel actually bad about the fact that there are lesser number of online tournaments wherein I can actually accumulate my credits and actually get like IA offers, because there are lesser number of credits or lesser number of online tournaments that I can actually do from a lesser developed city. On our side, the scale of credits is much higher, and the reason for why that makes sense is because you can get much more invited adjudicator offers or subsidized adjudicator offers on stuff like that. Before I move on, CO or O, do you have anything?
Yeah, but people in offline tournaments generally tend to be nice. Like we sound angry in debating, but if you go up to someone who is more famous than you and ask them, how's my speech? Doesn't make sense for them to say, fuck off, you're less popular than me.
No. So I'm not saying that people just say fuck off. I agree with you. I'm just saying that the scale of nice people is much more higher on our side when you access people from different circuits and different like regions of the area where they're likely to relate to you much better. So we're not disputing the social circle argument. We're saying that debating is a community-based sport and stuff like that. But you don't give any mechanisms for it. The mechanisms come on my speech, on specifically why seniors are likely to do this in feedback, why specifically feedback is more important, and why novices are integrated much more in the circuit. Then, why specifically are people likely to care about diversification more? Because specifically Because it's specifically true that if we care about this as a community sport, we also care about the fact that more amounts of voices emerge in the circuit and more amounts of people are granted representation across circuits. That enhances the value and the quality of debate. So most people are an inherent benefit that comes out of online debating, but also a benefit that comes out of them like giving scholarships. You can have fundraising communities that are scaled much more because the weighing of this is just on scale. You have much more benefits if all of those mechanisms are true on opening government. The third thing to notice over here is there are different avenues of relatability that you can find. Maybe you relate on social chat. Maybe you relate on like different kinds of communication channels and stuff like that. The justifying to your family that you can like have to go to a debating tournament when you absolutely have no chance of breaking is much more harder than justifying to them that I'm attending a free tournament where I have a waiver and I can specifically break in that tournament. So the scale of breaks, the scale of IA offers, and the scale of accessibility means that we win the debate on two stakeholders, on novices and on experienced debaters. Very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Now DLO.
Everyone, can you hear you see me?
Yep. See and hear
Yeah.
both.
Okay. Before I start my speech, this technically is me defending the wrong side. That's important. We all care a lot about online debating. So if you have a voice, if you have a power to vote in ABP Council, I ask you all to please vote for Pakistan ABP 2026. It will be the first ever online major in Asia hosted since 2023. And all the problems that you want to solve of giving debaters the chance and the ability to give them to speak on the largest scale and prove themselves is something that we all care about, something that I care about the most, which is why I'm helping convening that major. So, I hope you all, when you do go to ABP, you give us the vote. Cool. I can't say that in my speech because I'm defending the different side. Okay. We need to start very soon. Online debating has shaped debaters' life for the better, and we do not regret that. What we want to have in debating is an ability for people to connect with debating as intended, while still managing to get the benefits accrued. The first thing I'm going to deal with is opening government's argument that social circles tend to be very exclusive, so you're not able to get benefit. There are two levels here. The first is I just think this is not true. People and debaters are generally much more nicer in person. Yes, we're scary when we speak, but you generally do want to make friends regardless of things. People don't actively think about social hierarchies, even though they have different social communities, because they're not trying to exclude you at a point in which it's just casual conversation, etc. People like talking about the sport. But the second is that people generally are obligated to give you feedback when they judge you, so it just doesn't make sense that you cannot get this thing, etc., right? The second line of response is I'm going to flip this. I think it's actually far harder to gain community-based impacts for a few reasons. The first is that in online, it's very easy for people to ignore and ghost you. The intuition problem here is very simple. How many of you have texted a judge for feedback on a round and realized that you never got it regardless? I have been the benefactor and the receiver of this. Very sorry, but unfortunately, it's just easier to do this because people don't actively have that connection. The second issue here is that it's far harder to feel connected on the online circuit. Yes, we're all here connected via Zoom, but after this, I highly doubt we're going to have a post-tournament chat because we're just very far separated from each other. We're not really able to have the push to have that conversation, the push to etc. Right? The third is that relatability on a social level is often something that's very hard to escalate, etc. I.e., yes, I can probably talk and have a chat with my judge after this to ask them about feedback, but the next step to becoming friends and accessing social circles on an online level, unfortunately, just does go deeper to things like intimidation levels, to things like the factor of increase the fact you're just screaming into your screen. So I actually don't think opening opposition can prove a exclusive benefit of social interactions via accessibility. They needed to complete the argument by explaining how you're able to actually come into that level. Now, let's deal with the accessibility argument. I don't think they deal with our frame very clearly, and I want to just defend the frame here. Opening opposition in this debate has to defend status quo. What we frame is the status quo. Online debating has not died. It will never die. In fact, I would argue it is still larger than offline debating. And the very intuition, I don't even have to intuition pop this. This is just empirically true. This is important because we give you so many reasons to explain why is it likely that people still have a debating ability, an ecosystem to access tournaments. I.e., like if I struggle with hosting funds, I host Humor IV, I host Serious IV, I host Seasons WSDC. A lot of debating institutions host a lot of their own clubs to ensure that they're able to do this. Why is this crucial? This means that there's always an incentive to have an online ecosystem in the offline era. That's why Diliman debating, shout out to Jade, shout out to Bea, shout out to Nerkel, will always host a Diliman tournament 3 to 4 times a week, making sure that the prices are accessible so that everyone across Asia and Europe can access it. That's why other places, other tournaments, etc., like from every single Southeast Asian country and even the South Asian circuit will always be able to host these tournaments. But also, let's mitigate the harm of accessibility. Few ways here. The first is that scholarships from majors will always exist. Debating discourse in majors councils, debate series posting has made the awareness of debating majors far more important. Especially that's why we got things like Uru Worlds. That's why we got things like waiver, the normalization of waiver requests, huge levels of waivers to be able to be given for prestigious online tournaments, etc. In fact, even though, the second thing is just, I just think that the presence of online debating actually makes offline debating far more accessible because offline debating can no longer campaign on the level of experience. I.e., I know it's unfortunate that we've had 3 worlds in a row in regions that are shitty for Asia, but look at ABP and how it's slowly starting to direct back to a place which is far more accessible. Kuantan ABP was the cheapest offline major for like a really long, the cheaper offline major for a while. And if Pakistan ABP wins, you all get to go to ABP for $40. But that happens because you need to have a counterbalance to offline debating with online debating in the first place, which means people always have an alternative. Then they say, prestige and platform of offline debating shadows online debating. I just think this is untrue. In fact, I would argue that most people develop and build up their careers far better with online debating in their first place. In fact, literally, right? I made my career through online debating. The first few majors I broke at were online, and I was able to translate that to offline experience. I'm going to name drop here because I think it's just important to push my point. Look at Rishabh Gupta from DTU, probably a really, really great Indian debater from DTU. He still hasn't broken a major, but he managed to see a very good online tournaments from, I think, Power. I was at that, and a huge amount of people are able to do this. The structural reason as to why people are able to do this is very simple. The first is because of the fact that online tournaments generally have a slightly lower standard, also a more diverse standard. So most caps have an incentive to access online tournaments regardless. I know this technically isn't exclusive, but the fact that it isn't exclusive means OG can't win on it because we're simply explaining defense of the status quo. So you still have career upliftment in their first place, etc., etc. The second is because of the fact that online debating is just a way for you to build up your CV, etc. as a result to complement offline tournament, etc., etc. The third is that you'll always have an opportunity to fundraise for tournaments. Then their final claim here is that university admins are going to be terrible to you and be shitty to you. I just think this is, funnily enough, something that is symmetric. It's going to screw over clubs either way because the clubs who require university admin are going to be locked out, etc. Right. The tipping point here, though, don't have club access, you can still go to the local cheap offline tournament that we explained still occurs in the first place. As a result of that, it's still something that just matters less. Why is this important for opening opposition? The metric of accessibility is mitigated heavily simply by a defense of the counterfactual. They do not explain scale that heavily, i.e. the scale of requiring online benefits. So Kaitlin Ting explained a larger impact in the debate based on virtue of how it's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, the simple idea is if all the benefits are more on online debating, then in the absence of this trend, they will get more enlarged. So on scale, you can probably host more tournaments in the first place rather than hosting one offline tournament.
I get your point. So here's the weighing. On votes that you just can't win on scale. You just cannot win on scale. Why? Because the scale of online being far more normalized traits of the experience we analyzed in Caitlin's speech. What were these things? The first is just the nature of the boring technicalization of debating. The fact that people now in debating, like, we end up speaking so fast. I'm like a huge victim of this, right? Like, this is something that has kind of toxified the debating community in a way where we all just kind of think. But I think the second and most important thing is that this is where debaters opt out. We opt out because we don't feel the fun and gratitude in online debating. It's not sustainable. It's something that can be very important. It's beautiful to be able to speak in front of people, even if it's a small local tournament. It's beautiful to be able to speak to your judge and debaters at a friend after this, etc. This is something that people like doing. That's why we prioritize going to offline majors. On opening opposition, it's very simple. It doesn't matter if offline majors become offline or inaccessible. It matters that we have a presence of online and offline together to secure the best benefit.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Now, member of Gov.
Can I check if audible and visible?
Yep, both.
Okay. The first thing I would do is to explain the deadlock that happens in opening half. They try to dispute whether or not debating is more accessible when you have this online or offline tournament. The way in which CG breaks this deadlock is to explain in which the trend that affects the norms that would shift along with time and with experience. I think the first thing I want to note is that this trend of focusing on online tournaments creates more efficient and effective ways to debate online. So if the alternative from opposition is that we are going to have a hybrid, then this trend of creating more online tournaments means that we when we initially discovered Zoom and Discord, we will probably find more ways to optimize training and competing on outside of the house. But secondly, this also changes the norm of socializing online. If the trend is to continue online debating, then we do things like chat with your opponents online and to text your judges and to focus on try to interact with people by following them on social media, etc. These trends mean that you get used to these things, and this is what creates meaning in this spot. But more importantly, this is a time frame issue coming on opening opposition. Obviously, we just quote unquote ended COVID-19  1 or 2 years ago. We are still transitioning towards offline events, and we still obviously have online events that exist to a large degree. But look at things like Facebook debate pages. There are more and more offline tournaments and less online tournaments. Obviously, we will still have some local tournaments on both sides of the house, but the regretting of this trend means that we shift the norms around this sport. You reduce an emphasis on only local tournaments and focusing on your own circuit and creating more online tournaments. Therefore, this is important because as time goes on, a couple of years from now on, less and less online tournaments will exist. This is true because of things like opportunity cost. More and more people locally want a local tournament that happens in person. Therefore, the institutions that exist locally are pressured to host local ones that exist in person. This also is related to training because you focus more on your local circuit and debating with the people within your own circuit itself. This is bad because you don't focus on the online community and the communities that exist outside of your own country. The comparative on outside of the house is number one. You try to build the community that happens online and you try to talk to people and to converse with them through online means, even though it looks kind of lame, I have to talk to a screen. Obviously, this is still meaningful for a lot of individuals to be able to talk to other individuals from areas around us. But more importantly, you're more able to build a hybrid on outside of the house because if you're able to build the local tournaments, you're also able to control the online tournaments on outside of the house. The second thing I want to note here in this speech is to explain whether or not online debating is really more accessible, because I think opening house talk more about competing, but you don't talk about the background of competing, which is training and being able to access online resources. I think the premise of this argument is that most average debaters don't really have a lot of opportunities in most regions. I think number one, hosting an in-person tournament is just really, really very logistically challenging. You need number one, venues. You need number two, a lot of funding. Number three, you need judges and caps to exist in person. But number four, you also need participants to come down to your location to go and debate for these things. All of these harms are exacerbated because you need these things to exist in person, and you cannot have the excuse of them being behind a screen. You need people to travel. You need to cater to 100 over people in a convening hall. You need money to cover costs that come from things like food and beverages. These are just very hard for a lot of institutions to obtain. The comparative, therefore, is that you set up a Zoom meeting, you solve the issue of venue and cost, you find judges and participants internationally, you fill judge requirements and team caps much easier. It is just so expensive to go to local tournaments as a participant. I'm not going to drop $60 on SMU Hammers and NTUDC because these are just things that I cannot afford, because I don't earn that much money as a student. But secondly, and more importantly, things like trainings and spas, you obviously need to train with more people to get better, and you want to train internationally as well. The problem with this trend on like reverting back to offline events is that you're more likely to be focused on people in your institute or like in your country itself. So if I was from Singapore, I would probably spar with people like NYP and TP instead of trying to spar like online with like other countries and other nations. The problem with this is that you already spar with a lot of similar individuals on your side of the house anyway. And like also like the things about like being able to coach and people who are able to train you, especially for novices, the trend on outside of the house means that you like reduce the focus on having like actual person come down to the venue to train you, but you can get people from like internationally like to come and help you as well. This is good because if you don't have a logistical venue to come and host these things, then you're able to get these like benefits for especially for novices. But like also, thirdly, the existence of online communities also means that interacting with other people is so much easier. The trend therefore means that like asking for feedback and being able to reach out for these individuals are just far easier on outside of the house, because it means that the norms around like how we interact with people, because we don't have the physical proximity with them, changes on outside of the house. This is good for two reasons. The first is that it's just very easy to host tournaments, and it's easy for debaters to learn how to debate, especially if they are new, because you're able to access things like judges from like across the world, and you're also able to debate with people from across the world. But secondly, you also usually connect with people online anyway. I don't think it is true that you go to a major and you go and talk to someone in person. Like, I think it's just very unlikely. You usually just go and follow them on Instagram, or you go and text them online anyway on their side of the house. But before I move on to the extension, I'd like to take one from closing if there's any. Opening?
What is this mysterious normative force in online debating that suddenly encourages you to be like, I'm gonna talk with this dude from across the screen?
Yeah, so I think like the trend of online debating means that you focus less on local tournaments. So the non-existence of a local tournament means that you can only connect with your community online. I think that like if somebody wanted like meaning from that, then you would do that anyway. But I think the most important exception here, therefore, is for underprivileged individuals attending majors. The premise of this argument is that this has been historically hard like for teams to access, especially from teams of certain countries like the African continent or countries in Southern Asia. Think of how you perceive debaters who don't attend worlds or majors as somebody who doesn't succeed. This is very, very bad for like, and this is true for a couple of reasons. The first is just it's very like logistically infeasible to attend. You need to expedite visas. You need to manage travel issues in an extremely short period of time. I think like being able to go for a major means that you have to go through selections and things like that. So the time that you have to like deal with these logistical issues are just very, very short. But secondly, it's just so expensive to go to an international major. The recent Worlds was held in Panama, and even certain people in Singapore didn't go for these major because it was just so expensive no matter how privileged my country is. Think of other countries who are less privileged, or some people who just don't have the money for this travel. This is so important. So this debate is not about the average individual who can access every online tournament. It's about the people who want to like continue debating in university and who want to go to Worlds and represent their nation on the international stage. This is important for four reasons. The first is that this is literally the principle of debate. We want to be inclusive and accepting of people, but the existence of an in-person tournament means that we deny the ability for a lot of people to attend majors. But secondly, this also means that there's a little like less transfer of skills from their side of the house, because people just don't debate online anymore at a super high level. But most importantly, you don't build communities on their side of the house because you just isolate them from attending tournaments.
Hi, the speaker for the speech. Emil.
Hi. Okay. POS, if you just raise your hand in the Zoom, the raise hand reaction or chat, that's fine. Okay. Credit to where credit is due. Both government teams are admittedly very rational in their claims, because this is what a rational person would think. The problem is that we as a debater or a debating community are inherently irrational. We are using our free weekends to debate. We are skipping class and harming our grades to debate. We are spending our hard-earned money to debate. So breaking literally reduces us to tears, and this is an emotion that non-debaters will never get to understand. So this debate is not from the point of view of an average person, because we are not average people. That the beauty and joy of offline tournaments is too close to our hearts to be removed forever and to be a figment of history. The vast majority of my responses are just integrated into the extension. Yeah. So first, I just want to delineate that even if there are some similar conclusions to that of opening up, the problem with theirs was there was a lot of one-liners and assertions that they would claim, but there wasn't really any legwork done to prove likelihoods or incentives. So what we're gonna do is to fill in those blanks to prove why our claims are more likely to happen. That the comparative of government, which is a world of pure online debating, succinctly said by Prime Minister, is going to cause widespread disinterest and burnout. And basically, it is inferior to the actual experience of an offline tournament. So we hear the mechanisms because I don't think O really gave any other than it's really meaningful. First, it is significantly harder to connect with both your teammates and your opponents because you just close your device in an online tournament or you move on with your day. Why? This is because the environment that you are debating in. This is why it's significantly harder to study for an exam in like a really cozy room because that is not meant to push your intellectual rigor. But if you're in a building or you're in a school or an actual tournament, your instincts are more likely to push yourself to learn and be more intense. Number two, it's harder to connect with your very own teammates or your org as a whole. At best, when you're like, oh, I feel really sad, I feel really good, you talk to them online through a couple of text messages. As we learned from the pandemic, a connection is significantly worse when it is done online compared to the physical election because humans were biologically trained to foster physical connections and to see each other that it really changes a lot. So what this means is that this is why during the pandemic, the vast majority of the debating community missed face-to-face debating. And the specific nuance to this is because when you're in a world where you have no option but to debate in your room, to debate online, there comes a point where it gets tiring, where you lose the fun and joy that you get out of it because any form of, if you were a face-to-face debater before, those become memories. But if you're never a face-to-face debater, then all you hear are fun stories, but you never got to experience it for yourself. So in comparison, why are face offline tournaments just better for the experience? And these are three specific mechanisms. Number one, a physical support system with your institution mates is significantly easier to help deal with the losses, for example, to help deal with not breaking. That when you get a physical hug from your best friend in the org, it's significantly better and it makes losing a little bit better. But number two, the fact that it is easier and more fun to make new friends. Face-to-face only events like break nights or social dinners are the best avenue to make friends with different institutions that you would have never dreamed of interacting with in the first place, which is why LaSalle has friends in Malaysia and other circuits and other circuits. Number three, debating. The act of debating is just more intense and it is more memorable. That it is different to do it in your room when it feels like there are no stakes versus when you're in an actual building when you're POIing, actually physically POIing, and you can visibly see the intensity in either your teammates or your opponent's faces. What this means. So it is easier to make speeches that move people or to have to be moved by speeches. What this proves is that with all these mechanisms, the offline experience is just objectively better and more conducive to loving the sport and learning from that sport instead of getting burnt out and tired. This is why the second extension proves why this specific reversion is significantly is going to be done well essentially. That the nuance, which I think was missed from both OGCG and OO, is that face-to-face tournaments today are wildly different from the face-to-face tournaments before the pandemic. What they explained was a tournament in like 2017, 2018. But because we learned so much, especially positives from online debating, we can adopt those principles into our face-to-face tournaments to ensure that the superior learning experience is gradually and eventually become very accessible, because we can't deny that it is a better experience, but because of the way we're reverting to face-to-face tournaments now, we're pushing it to become more accessible. Because unlike these measures don't just exist because of the reversion, and this is important. They are being normalized and expected within majors. Major tournaments are now expected to provide visa support to countries with weaker visas, for example. That major tournaments, whether it be a big major like Worlds or a more regional major, are expected to give a lot of scholarships to underprivileged teams and countries, because that is what we learn of the positive benefits of accessibility in online debating. And this was specifically caused by the reversion that happened after the things we learned in our online debating. Yeah, POI.
Your case assumes that OCs are very responsible, but debaters who can afford irrationality are people who are oftentimes very privileged. So either your case only catered to these privileged people, or it becomes more accessible on the certain benefits of growth to novices and to people from diverse
Yeah, like the whole point of my second extension is to prove why we're making it more accessible, and it's being constantly expected and pushed to make these major tournaments more accessible at the end of the day. This is also things like minority quotas in Australia's WGM, by the way, which a lot of these things are things we have never seen before the pandemic. So it is significantly worse off if we are regretting these pushes and these new developments in the debating circuit. So unlike OO, we actually have been engaging with Gov that yes, access is fundamentally important. And the problem is the reversion in it of itself is the biggest way to make this move. That it's something that we shouldn't regret because we have evolved the nature of what offline debatings should be and what they are. That at least in closing opposition, the option exists for people who want to, or for people who want to make it more accessible for others out there. And not regretting makes this very option more accessible. That we are irrational and we find joy and comfort in irrational things like face-to-face tournaments, but it is worth regretting if we make face-to-face tournaments a thing of the past and fun measures are just all online now. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Now I would like to invite government.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This team doesn't understand how the norms of socializing will change when online debating eventually becomes a more and more prevalent thing. What does this look like? This looks like after this debate happens, we will probably all turn on our cameras and then we'll start talking to each other like, oh my god, this debate, I don't know what was happening, things like that. And you'll actually have these chats after the debates that happen. Similarly, to like whatever happens in face-to-face comms, because the points at which you make connections with people is usually after people oh, oh, and you actually talk to them. So the increase comes people want to socialize at comms. So these things are still going to happen. These things are going to increase in frequency, and these things are still going to make you feel good. Like Cheng Xiang was like, oh, so freaking happy about getting glazed by champion, right? Like these things are still going to happen, and these are the ways that we'll feel emotionally connected to people. But also it just feels really good to be glazed by someone who is like from such a different circuit from you that you just saw for one moment, right? Like people are still incentivized to be nice to people. People are still later. People are still incentivized to build connections with people, and this will happen if this eventually becomes a norm. Your point.
Yeah, so you get to go to SMU Hammers and you get to go to Diliman. You get to socialize with your Singaporean friends and also international friends, which is the op counterfactual, by the way.
Wait, the off counterfactual is that like some comms may happen, but it may not be as common to have it in person. So, but the next is that it's not just about like going to international comms, right? Like most likely local comms may also go online, and we don't think that this makes much of a difference. It's just like how my friend Jovan from like TP is like texting me after every round. Is like, oh my god, your jaws are like this. Oh, I hope like you win this person. Or like, oh, please be my coach so that I can like make fun of him about it. Like these things are still going to happen. People are still going to make connections, and people are still going to maintain connections even in online instances, and you're going to spend the time in between rounds like texting different people. And in fact, we argue that it's better, right? Because you can actually talk to multiple people at the same time, because it's very difficult to actually access like people in person sometimes, like after the round is done, then like the OA is done, and then you can't find them after lunch or things like that. So like the other problem that we solve is also that because this becomes a norm. This means that things like ghosting in terms of your getting ghosted when you're asking for feedback is probably less likely to happen, because it just becomes more of a norm for people to expect feedback from each other, and people are still going to like to connect with each other. But the next is that it's just generally nice to be able to have friends from like different countries, because debating is the one sport where you're actually able to access people from different countries. Like when I came into debating, I was so surprised that like, oh, my coach like knows like billions of people from like okay, not billions, but a lot of people from like different countries, right? And I think it's a really cool concept to be able to connect with someone and to learn about, like it feels very boring to just learn about the state of the politics in like the Philippines or something. But it's a lot cooler to actually like, have a friend who is from the Philippines that you can actually talk to about these things. And debating is the platform that is able to allow you to connect with these individuals from different countries. But the next is that this debate is not just about like the international connections that you make, right? But it's also about the local connections. So Cheng Xiang actually talks to you about this. Cheng Xiang tells you that trainings and spars, if they eventually become online, then instead of just sparring against NYP and TP, we also get coaches from other countries. We are also less focused on our institution. So what does this mean? This actually looks like, I think the first observation to make about like this claim and its relevance is that a lot of good coaches are eventually going to coach good schools in the country anyway. So this looks like the best coaches or the best debaters will eventually end up coaching the best schools, because number one, they pay the most money, but the second is that they probably came from those schools. So this looks like Sean Lee like coaching Hwa Chong, right? Which is like, in order to get a Hwa Chong, you have to get like straight A's for your high school, which is incredibly difficult in like such a developed country, right? And this means that this locks like debating to become like a sport where like a lot of the only the richest or only the most academically focused people have the most access to this. Because even if you didn't come from the best high school, you had to go to the best university in order to be in one of the best teams, debating with the best other teammates, being able to get feedback from the best from the other best debaters in the circuit in every single training. And we tell you that this is so important, because this means that a lot more people can access good debaters even on a local level. So this means that, okay, because like Singapore, like our institution is not great, but the reason, like, we are very lucky to have Kaitlin Ting, because like Kaitlin Ting is the only reason why we are like we can debate really well, right? Because we get feedback from him for like 2 hours every week. And the idea is that if online debating was a norm, this means that more people can access Kaitlin Ting. So this is not just about a local circuit, but this is also about international circuit. Because most of the best debaters are like located in certain countries. This means that if you are able to access international coaches, this is so helpful for you, because the way that you improve as a debater is not just about it's not just by going for competitions, right? It's the weekly trainings that you get to have. And if it becomes a norm that training is online, then this means that more people can put all their funding into like getting a location for training every week, into just getting a good coach, which greatly increases the like quality of the coach that you can have, which is so important for many debaters. But the next is that like coaching and all of these moments of like glazing and like having emotional connection with people is not limited to like debating like face to face. Like a lot of the best moments that I had with like who I feel are my personal mentors, or who I feel are, or like my dearest coach Kaitlin Ting came from online, right? It's like all of the times where like I was telling him about debating, and I was like, oh my god, Kaitlin Ting, I feel like I'm the worst debater in the world and I don't want to debate anymore. And then he proceeded to tell me about the stories that he had, right? These are the moments, these are the conversations that usually happen online, that are the things that change you. These are the things that are deeply emotional to you, and these are the emotional connections, and these are the reasons why you stay. The reasons why you stay is because you are always connected with your friends, because you are best friends with your fellow debate partners, and you send them debate memes. Okay, maybe you don't send them debate memes, but like you send them just funny things about debating, and you make everything about debating, and you like say funky things during the conversations that you have with them. A lot of these things happen online. They don't have to happen in person. Most of them happen online. And the reason why this is true is because online also gives you more accessibility. This looks like me being able to get me still being able to connect with like someone that judged me through online, right? And still being able to tell them and confide in them whenever I have issues with debating.
I thank the speaker for the speech. Now I would like to invite the op-rep.
Hello, can I confirm if I'm audible?
Audible and visible. Yep.
Okay, great. POIs through voice, or you can raise them in chat. Give me a second. Okay, I'll start. Okay. The debating community, as of now, is built and standing on the shoulders of giants. People who care about inclusivity, people who care about the minorities, and people who have been spread across different equitable institutions, people who care about bids, people who care about visas, and people who care about color and how they translate into the decisions that we make. We would argue that the trend manifests into the same line of logic and into the same lines of principles that every team in this round tries to debate upon. And that is why we think we should still give a chance to these offline tournaments to exist and to be in pursuit of. I want to strategically position Gabi, and by extension, I will also explain why Gabi wins us over our opening bench. And then I'll move on to explaining why we win over opening government, and then moving on to closing government as well. So the first one here is that I just want to clarify the motion burden. One, the motion doesn't ask us to abolish or leave online tournaments in pursuit of reverting back to the offline, but it is to explain why we want this to exist and to be an option that people can opt into in the case that there are bids that exist, or in the case in which institutions want to have this and want to host this at best. The unique mechanisms on why we would say that online tournaments exist, which is different from our opening, is just that one, it's just far more equitable to offer an online tournament because it is something accessible, like we do agree with opening government on this. Secondly, it is just far more convenient to have this for many reasons, such as you can just earn more money, or just that it's just easier to host a tournament and do it on Discord. So we think that there are pragmatic interests and incentives on why online tournaments would exist. And just quite rationally, offline tournaments are hard to host. And that is why if there are people who want to host them, we should allow them the choice to have that. And that is something that is exclusive. This is an important positioning because, and by the way, OO doesn't really do this. And this is important because one, benefits like diversity, integrating novices, and gaining friends or even exposures are symmetric at best because this option exists. And therefore, this is a less relevant issue in the debate. Secondly, our world is quite different. On closing opposition is that we have a variation of debate tournament that exists. Like if people do want to host this, you can do this because unlike government bench, we aren't regretting the fact. The fact that you are regretting this from happening or from reverting to these types of tournament means that there is massive backlash for people or institutions who want to host offline tournaments, or it becomes widely unpopular. And this is the world that government needs to defend, not just a world in which it is bad, but they need to defend a world where they regret it and it's completely absent of it all. And that is why the second reason on why we win is that we just build opening government's model far more better and we compare it a bit, right? So the most important harm that we get coming from Gabi is that you disincentivize debaters because there are individuals still, because debaters exist in a spectrum, right? There are individuals and actors that exist that want to experience face-to-face tournaments, and that these are people who experience more proximate burnout in the existence or in the nature of online tournaments because people experience and enjoy debate quite differently. So for example, this is an important harm because accessibility or like inaccessibility, exclusion, and diversity, all of the harms that government explains, already has a solution in our comparative because these things exist, like online tournaments exist for the many reasons that I've mentioned earlier. But our harm in which people cannot push out their intellectual rigor, people cannot push their own potential, to knock on the tables when they want to say here, here, to be felt that they are seen and that they are heard by people because it is tangible and it is proximate and it is physical right in front of them. These are things that do not have any alternatives at all. And that is why it is important and it is debate winning. Because if these types of harms do not have any alternatives, then they are far more important. And this is why we win over OO. Because OO just says that, well, it exists on both ends. But this strategic weighing and this strategic logic on why people want it is the reason why we want this to exist. Because there are people who want to get this but cannot on the comparative on government bench. So for that reason, we went over opening. And that is why we also think that all of the benefits that they say is symmetric on our ends, but the harm that we explain still stands. They don't disprove why this is unlikely to happen or why this is less important. I want to therefore move on to opening government. Their biggest harm is that it is incredibly inaccessible for geographical and financial reason. I think this is just empirically quite untrue, because CAP and WGM, Asian representative, already increases our incentive to make this accessible. OO only says that they try to mitigate this harm, but we explain that this is just short term. And this is important because let's just bite the bullet. If options are incredibly exclusive, like it's just so exclusive, people in Asia, people in Pakistan, people in India cannot opt in to the kinds of bids that we have right now, then it means that there is an online tournament that will rise up, and that is where we will opt into it because we know how exclusive it is. And this is important because it means that their biggest harm is self-correcting. If it is so bad, so urgent, and so severe as they say, then we will have alternatives that will rise up and we will push to that. And because it is self-correcting, it is again it is just less important. So we win over OO because they just try to disprove or they just try to dismiss it, but we explain why this will be solved either way. But before I move on to the second response, go.
Your mechanisms of self-correction contradict your case, because if you're trying to protect the preferences of some debaters who are privileged and you want to give them face-to-face interactions, then you exclude a huge number of debaters who are especially novices, especially from diverse circuits, using different online circuits, and cannot access world-class judges or feedback.
Oh, so the first response there is that not really, because if there is one offline tournament, there might be other offline tournaments that will exist, not maybe majors. Tournaments will still exist on our end, but if it's just so bad, then maybe we will make it online, but that doesn't mean that other offline tournaments will be abolished. So those things can coexist at the same time. So the second thing that I want to say is that they say that, well, what if OCs are incredibly irresponsible, right? I think this is just empirically quite untrue as well, because we've experienced in the world's Panama recently that visa issues have prevented major cities, countries in Asia, or countries in other countries to go there. And this is why backlash exists. Even institutional legitimacy exists. And even corporations like EduDrift care about optics. So we already do prove why they're unlikely to be irresponsible, and that's just logically assertive at best. The last thing, and this is a little bit quite similar, because closing government quite rides the same premise as their opening, and it's at the norm that people will socialize. I think it's just illogical because it operates on the generalization that everyone in debate has the social battery to do this. But even if there are some who may interact, it's just not all. And because it is just quite logically inconsistent, it means that it is just not that important in the round. So this means that we better respond to this than opening opposition, because OO just says that, well, you can ghost them because online exists, but we agree that you cannot ghost them, but sometimes people just don't want it. So the incentive just isn't there. So we win for many reasons. One is we just say, and we point out what is symmetric and what is not relevant, but we also point out what is something that is just the most important thing in the debate that no one has ever responded to. I'm more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks for an extremely fun round. Yep. Recording is going on. So I will first give the comments about the debate, and then I think we can go into the comparisons of different sides and how the debate panned out. All right. We thought that it is a long diagonal win. So we gave the first to opening government. We gave the second to closing opposition. We gave the third to opening opposition. We give the fourth to closing government. So the call is OG, CO, OO, and C2. What are some general comments about this round? I think this round was quite interesting in a way, in the sense that I think all sides had different sort of characterization of what status quo looks like or what is future. The problem with that, however, is that I think none of the sides spent enough time explaining how exactly their world would look like. It's extremely unsure at multiple sides of how the characteristics of online and offline debating are looking like. Like, what are the frequencies of these tournaments on both sides? What kind of tournaments? Like, if local tournaments are happening in a certain way, how do the majors look like? And so on and so forth. So I think a characterization of what each world looks like on both sides would have been really helpful in this round. And this is like the only piece of feedback I guess I have in this particular round itself of how it was done. The way I like to conduct how I compare sizes by like going in the order of how the debate happened. I'll talk about the opening half first, then bringing CG, then bring in CO. All right, opening half done. What does OG tell me? I think OG has a bunch of things to talk about, and the first and major crux of all of this is the idea that it's not accessible for most number of people to do offline tournaments. How do they do this? I think they do this by multiple levers, which is to say that the reason why these tournaments are not accessible is mainly because of time and money, like things like travel, accommodation, and so on and so forth. And secondly, they talk about how good tournaments necessarily happen outside of your own particular country, which reflects problems of visa, flights, bribing corrupt officers, or things like you just having a weaker currency, which means that you have to just pay way more than you are supposed to. All of these are barriers of entry, which necessarily affect people. The further what they talk about is that the rise of these offline tournament means that the majors and the most important tournaments are going to get conducted offline, and only the privileged get access to this. This looks like you having good organizations or good admins and rich institutions which necessarily have prestige being able to access this tournament from the get-go, which means that A, they get better amount of experience, but two, they have a good amount of reputation as well. All of this means that you improve as a debater, and all of these things are inaccessible for the most number of people. There's the main crux of what OG case looks like. What does O tell me? O tells me that the world they necessarily need to defend is the status quo, where online tournaments still continue to exist in parallel to offline tournaments. For example, obviously, like this tournament and multiple tournaments like Guru Worlds and so on, which means that you necessarily have things like free YouTube workshop videos, and all of this continue to still ongoing and on, which means there are only very select few tournaments which are going to get offline completely. The examples which they drop here is things like Cambridge, LSC, and so on. Secondly, their main crux of case looks like things like emotional bonds and the kind of friends you make and the bonds you necessarily make at a local tournament. You say that you meet like-minded people, and this happens across institutions and across countries, which is to say that people like novices necessarily go tournaments, make friends, and get attacked. They make exist to fix a lot of tournaments. Like I'm necessarily not sure. Yeah, I'm necessarily not sure of why this is necessarily more important than OG is pushing for. The way OO necessarily tries to tackle accessibility is by arguing for things like accessibility can still happen on their side. My problem is this is at best a mitigation, which doesn't necessarily mitigate all the degrees of harms which OG is necessarily talking about in accessibility. So at best, I believe that O is able to prove some sort of accessibility, which means that if I compare a 2018 offline tournament to a 2025 offline tournament, I am more like inclined to believe that it will be comparatively more accessible than the one in 2018, but I'm not sure if it will be accessible enough to mitigate the harms which OG is talking about. But secondly, the way in which OO doesn't do, OG does by saying that accessibility is the most important thing in this round, because it means that the people who necessarily are great and are amazing debaters lack and don't succeed in this activity because they can't go to a Cambridge or an Oxford or particular major. But secondly, I think OO just caveats out the idea that tournaments going to still happen online. But I think OG is really clear from the get-go that the tournament most prestigious and most important continue to happen online, offline, so on and so forth. Things like majors, things like important tournaments like Oxford and so on continue to happen offline. I don't think O is able to take down the point. But thirdly, even if they're able to mitigate, I don't think they weigh over the idea by emotional bonds you make necessarily are the barrier or the most important, proving that accessibility being the most important thing over O. Half of this round. CG. Main premise is what similar to opening accessibility, and they mainly talk about a few things. One, they also talk about how it is extremely cheap for you to organize tournaments, which is to say that you don't have to book banquet halls, you just need to buy a Zoom account. The fact that you can necessarily get international judges by just paying them a nominal amount of fee to judge in the Zoom rooms, and so on and so forth. And secondly, how you can necessarily still make bonds in terms of access coaches online and so forth. Why does CG lose out to their opening half? I think the problem which we had as a panel from CG is that it seemed like CG is quite derivative from their opening government. The reason for this is the impact which CG is necessarily reaching in terms of proving why accessibility is the most important. It's also the same impact which OG reads, which on its own, it's not exactly why they're necessarily derivative, but it's also that the mechanism which they prove for this accessibility, things like time, money, registration fee, the cost of accommodation and everything else are also the same mechanisms which OG uses. The additional mechanisms of you getting access to coaches and so on, which has happened more in the online world, where you are necessarily, as an underrepresented institution, access to great debaters online is unique. However, the problem which we have with this argumentation is again that it is not weighed against their opening government as well, because opening government also has similar mechanisms of how you can necessarily get connected to people via Discord, Zoom, and so on, which means the social media channels exist. I think from the social existence of the social media channels, CG is able to derive a newer impact of getting access to things like coaches and so on on the online world. I'm just not really sure why this impact matters more than what OG is probably given. I think this impact is also not weighed over opening opposition's idea of how this is better for novices in terms of making bonds and making friends. So I think I'm in the absence of that weighing, I'm not really sure why this argument is more important than what opening half is saying. I concede that this is important because they are able to explain why coaches are matter. I just don't know why this argument matters more than what their opening half has already talked about. Considering this, I think CG falls out from their opening bench. Why do I think, how does CO come into the round, and why do we think that they take second? What does CO do? I think CO's case is essentially the premise of what OO is talking about, but we think that it's done better in a few ways. And the first thing which CEO particularly does is to show the exclusivity of things of which you can't achieve in a social media chat. I think O is quite limited in terms of talking about the emotional bonds and why physical presence is important. They mention that physical presence of people is important because it makes you more approachable. I'm just not sure why it makes you particularly approachable. It's not something which is explained at opening opposition. CEO goes a step further by giving instances and giving a much better characterization of what this interaction offline looks like. This looks like hanging out with your friends after a round, or vaping with them, or just having physical presence of a person when you necessarily don't break, and why that is infinitely much better. And all of those things are necessarily solidify what CO is talking, what O already talked about. But even if I think that this is similar to what O is saying at the worst case, I still think they beat out OO just in terms of attempts at weighing this argument over opening government and closing government. I think CO is far more comparative than opening opposition when they try to compare this idea of emotional bonds and availability of people and compare this against what government is trying to present. The way they try to do this is by talking about how accessibility is something which is symmetric on both sides, and they necessarily also posit that this is harm which is exclusive only at side government, which does not exist on theirs. So the weighing metric becomes the exclusivity of the bonds you make. This is a weighing metric which only uniquely comes at CO, which allows them to compare with their government bench. In the absence of that at opening opposition, I'm just not really sure what is the importance metric which is presented at opening oppositions. This metric exists at closing opposition. Considering that, on a very close margin, we think that CO takes it over OO. Why do they still lose to OG? Even though I think the weighing metric exists in terms of exclusivity, I just don't get that accessibility is symmetric on both sides. As I explained previously, I think the reason still stands similar, that OG is able to prove the harms of accessibility. So at best, what CO does is to mitigate to an extent of what this accessibility looks like. I don't think they mitigate to the full degree of the argument itself. I don't see why at CO's world, majors won't be treated as the best tournaments ever, as OG already talked about, that these are the tournaments which matter, or which create your debating reputation, or the ones which create the debating's biggest achievements happening offline, and those are the ones which are inaccessible, this point still stands at opening government. So I'm not really sure accessibility is necessarily symmetric. So I have a hard time buying the idea that this idea is symmetric. And if it's not symmetric, and accessibility is a problem, is elated by OG, and it still remains in the dark, I think OG does a far better legwork in terms of proving that accessibility is the more important thing in this round, and much more with a much more concrete evidence. Why did they beat out CG? I think the problem is that this metric of proving by accessibility is not symmetric, and by accessibility is a unique harm exclusively comes at OG and not at CG. In the absence of this at CG, and in the presence of a weighing metric which exists at CO in terms of why this harm is exclusive, I don't think CG spends enough time comparing themselves with CO and telling why they exclusively beat CO's idea with their own unique impacts. In the absence of that, and CO proving to us why the harm exists on both sides, it is enough for them to edge out against closing government, but not against opening government. Hence, the call stands at the way it is. So, hence, the final call becomes OG, OO, OG, CO, OO, and CG. If you guys have any questions, you can let me know. For personal feedback, I can reach out to me on this spot. Thank you so much.